Hey there! Grab yourself a coffee and enjoy the story. Elizabeth Thompson stood in the doorway of what had been her sanctuary for 37 years, watching her son-in-law, Derek Hayes, pace across the hardwood floors that her late husband, Robert, had lovingly installed with his own hands. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains she had sewn decades ago, casting delicate shadows that seemed to dance mockingly around the tension filling the room. Just 32 days had passed since she had buried the love of her life, and already the vultures were circling. "Elizabeth, you need to face reality." Derek's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His expensive suit, perfectly tailored and immaculate, contrasted sharply with the casual warmth of the family home. At 42 years old, Derek had always carried himself with an arrogance that made Elizabeth's skin crawl, but today that arrogance had transformed into something far more sinister. "You're 66 years old. You can't possibly maintain this property on your own. The mortgage payments alone will crush you." Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she clutched the pearl necklace Robert had given her on their 25th wedding anniversary. The smooth surface of each pearl had become her anchor in the storm that had engulfed her life since that terrible morning when she found Robert collapsed in their garden, his hands still dirty from tending to the roses he had planted for her birthday. The doctors said his heart had simply given out, a massive attack that claimed him before the ambulance could even arrive. The memory of that morning played in her mind like a broken record. The way the coffee cup had shattered when it fell from her trembling hands, the sound of her own screams echoing through the empty house, the desperate way she had pressed her ear to his chest, hoping against hope to hear even the faintest heartbeat. "This house has been our home for over 3 decades, Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. That clock had been Robert's pride and joy, a family heirloom passed down through generations of Thompson men. Its steady rhythm had marked every significant moment of their marriage, their children's first steps, birthday celebrations, quiet Sunday mornings spent reading the newspaper together. She could still picture Robert winding it every Sunday evening, a ritual he had maintained for as long as she could remember. Derek's laugh was cold and calculating, the sound grating against Elizabeth's already frayed nerves. "Sentimental nonsense won't pay the bills, Elizabeth. Sarah and I have discussed this extensively, and we've reached a decision that's best for everyone involved." He gestured toward the kitchen where Elizabeth could hear her daughter Sarah moving around, presumably avoiding this confrontation. The sound of cabinet doors opening and closing echoed through the house, like gunshots in the uncomfortable silence. The kitchen had always been the heart of their home, where Elizabeth had prepared thousands of meals over the years. She remembered teaching Sarah how to make Robert's favorite apple pie in that very kitchen, flour dusting every surface as they worked together, laughing at their messy attempts. Those memories seemed like echoes from another lifetime now, golden moments that Derek's presence was systematically poisoning. "You've discussed my future without including me in the conversation?" Elizabeth's voice carried a note of disbelief that she couldn't quite suppress. Her silver hair, once perfectly styled for Robert's funeral, now hung limply around her shoulders. She hadn't bothered with makeup in weeks, and the black dress she wore seemed to hang on her diminishing frame like a shroud. The weight loss had been dramatic since Robert's passing. Food had lost all taste and meaning when there was no one to share meals with. "We're thinking practically, something you clearly aren't capable of doing right now," Derek continued, his tone becoming more aggressive with each word. "This house is worth nearly $800,000 in today's market. Sarah inherited it fair and square, and we need to liquidate the asset to secure our family's future. You can find a nice little apartment somewhere, maybe one of those senior living communities. It would be much more appropriate for someone in your situation." The words hit Elizabeth like physical blows. She sank into Robert's favorite armchair, the worn leather still carrying the faint scent of his cologne. How many evenings had they spent here together, she reading her romance novels while he worked on his business documents? Thompson Construction had been their shared dream, built from nothing into one of the most respected building companies in the county. Robert had started with just a pickup truck and a toolbox, working 16-hour days to provide for his growing family. She remembered the calluses on his hands, the way he would come home exhausted, but still find energy to help with homework and bedtime stories. The business had grown slowly but steadily over the years. Elizabeth had been there from the beginning, handling the books, answering phones, and even helping with small construction tasks when manpower was short. She knew every client, every supplier, every employee by name. The thought of Derek taking over something she and Robert had built together felt like a desecration of her husband's memory. "The business," Elizabeth began, her mind struggling to process the implications of Derek's words. "What about Thompson Construction? Robert always said it would provide for me if something happened to him." Derek's expression shifted, and for a moment, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of something predatory in his eyes. "The business is part of Sarah's inheritance, naturally. But let's be honest, Elizabeth. What does an elderly woman know about running a construction company? The industry has changed dramatically in recent years. It requires a strong male presence, someone who can command respect from the contractors and suppliers. I've already been working closely with the foreman, preparing to take over operations." The presumption in his voice made Elizabeth's stomach churn. Derek had never shown the slightest interest in Robert's business beyond the profits it generated. He worked in some vague capacity at a marketing firm downtown, a job that seemed to involve more networking lunches than actual work. Robert had often expressed his concerns about Derek's character, though he had always been too polite to voice his reservations directly. Elizabeth remembered late-night conversations where Robert worried about Sarah's choice in husband, his intuition warning him about Derek's true nature long before today's confrontation. "You've been working with the foreman behind my back?" Elizabeth asked, her voice growing sharper. "Robert hasn't even been gone 2 months, and you're already making plans to dismantle everything he built?" Derek straightened his tie with an air of satisfaction. "I prefer to think of it as modernizing operations. The construction industry is becoming increasingly competitive, and Thompson Construction needs leadership that understands current market dynamics. Your husband was undoubtedly skilled for his time, but his methods were becoming outdated." The casual dismissal of Robert's life's work ignited something fierce within Elizabeth's chest. Robert had been respected throughout the industry, known for his integrity and craftsmanship. Clients specifically requested Thompson Construction because they knew the work would be done right the first time. The company had never missed a deadline or gone over budget on any project under Robert's leadership. "Sarah should be part of this conversation," Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger despite the emotional turmoil raging inside her chest. "She's my daughter, and if these decisions affect our family, she should have the courage to face me directly." Derek's jaw tightened, and he walked to the kitchen doorway. "Sarah, come in here. Your mother wants to discuss our decision with you." Elizabeth heard her daughter's footsteps approaching, each step seeming to echo with reluctance. When Sarah finally appeared in the doorway, Elizabeth's heart broke a little more. Her 38-year-old daughter looked exhausted, her once bright eyes now dull and shadowed with what appeared to be a mixture of guilt and resignation. Sarah had always been beautiful, inheriting Robert's warm brown eyes and Elizabeth's delicate features, but motherhood and marriage had worn her down in ways that went far beyond the natural passage of time. The transformation in Sarah had been gradual but unmistakable. The confident young woman who had graduated with honors from college had slowly been replaced by this hesitant shadow. Elizabeth had watched helplessly as Derek's controlling nature had systematically stripped away her daughter's independence, isolating her from friends and family until Derek's voice became the only one Sarah trusted. "Mom," Sarah began, but her voice faltered immediately. She couldn't meet Elizabeth's gaze, instead focusing on a spot somewhere beyond her mother's shoulder. Derek's right about the practical aspects. The house is too much for you to handle alone, and the business requires someone who understands the modern construction industry. Elizabeth studied her daughter's face, searching for any trace of the compassionate child she had raised. This woman standing before her seemed like a stranger, someone who had been hollowed out and filled with Derek's poison. "When did you become so cold, Sarah? When did money become more important than family loyalty?" "It's not about being cold," Sarah replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's about being realistic. Derek has a plan that will benefit everyone. You'll have money from the house sale to live comfortably, and we'll be able to modernize the business operations." Elizabeth rose from the chair, her legs unsteady but her resolve beginning to crystallize. The wedding photo on the mantelpiece caught her eye, showing a younger version of herself and Robert on their wedding day, their faces glowing with hope and love. That young woman could never have imagined that her own daughter would one day try to strip away everything she and her husband had built together. "And what if I refuse? What if I choose to fight for what Robert and I built together?" Derek stepped forward, his mask of false politeness finally slipping completely. "Then you'll lose everything anyway, but with additional legal fees that will drain whatever resources you might have left." "Elizabeth, I'm trying to be generous here. Take the deal we're offering, pack your belongings, and leave peacefully. You have 10 days to make arrangements." The ultimatum hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Elizabeth looked from Derek to Sarah, seeing clearly for the first time how completely her daughter had fallen under her husband's influence. The strong-willed child who had once defended stray animals and stood up to schoolyard bullies had been replaced by this submissive shadow of her former self. 10 days, Elizabeth repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're giving me 10 days to abandon the life I built with your father?" "It's more than fair," Derek said, adjusting his tie with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had already won. "Most people in your situation would be grateful for such generosity." Elizabeth walked slowly to the window that overlooked the garden where Robert had spent countless hours nurturing their shared dreams. The roses were still blooming, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkness that had invaded her home. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, remembering how Robert used to bring her fresh flowers every Friday, how he would surprise her with small gestures of love, even after 37 years of marriage. "I'll need time to think," she said finally, not turning around to face them. 10 days, Elizabeth," Derek repeated firmly. "After that, we'll be forced to take legal action to protect Sarah's inheritance." Elizabeth heard their footsteps retreating, followed by the sound of Derek's car starting in the driveway. The house fell silent except for the persistent ticking of the grandfather clock, each second marking time toward an uncertain future. She remained at the window as darkness began to fall, watching the automatic sprinklers come on in the garden, faithfully continuing their programmed routine, even though the man who had set them up was gone forever. 3 sleepless nights had passed since Derek's ultimatum, and Elizabeth found herself sitting at the kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning, surrounded by a sea of documents that seemed to mock her with their complexity. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across the papers, creating an almost surreal landscape of legal jargon and financial statements that Robert had always handled. Her hands shook as she tried to make sense of mortgage documents, insurance policies, and business contracts that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The coffee had grown cold hours ago, but Elizabeth continued to sip it mechanically, needing something to occupy her hands while her mind raced through impossible scenarios. 7 days remained of Derek's deadline, and each passing hour felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. She had always trusted Robert to handle their finances, content to focus on raising Sarah, and supporting the family business in ways that didn't require understanding the intricate details of contracts and legal obligations. Now that trust felt like a cruel joke. How could she have been so naive? How could she have allowed herself to remain ignorant of the very foundations that supported her life? The shame burned in her chest, mixing with grief and fear to create a cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. Robert had tried to explain their financial situation many times over the years, but she had always waved him off, trusting that he would handle everything. Now she was paying the price for that willful ignorance. The telephone on the wall seemed to stare at her accusingly. She had considered calling their family lawyer, Mr. James Mitchell, dozens of times over the past 3 days, but something held her back. Perhaps it was pride, or maybe it was the fear that he would confirm Derek's claims about her helplessness. James had been Robert's friend for over 20 years, handling all of Thompson Construction's legal matters and the couple's personal affairs. But would he see her as Robert's capable partner, or would he view her as Derek did, a helpless, elderly woman incapable of understanding her own circumstances? The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway startled Elizabeth from her dark thoughts. Through the kitchen window, she could see Derek's silver sedan parked behind her modest Honda. Her stomach clenched with dread as she watched him stride toward the front door with the confident swagger of someone who believed he already owned everything he surveyed. The doorbell rang once, then again with aggressive insistence, when she didn't immediately respond. "Elizabeth, I know you're in there." Derek's voice carried through the wooden door. "We need to discuss the arrangements for your departure. Time is running short, and there are practical matters that need attention." She considered not answering, but the futility of hiding became apparent when Derek began knocking with increasing force. With a deep breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Elizabeth walked to the front door and opened it slowly. Derek stood on her doorstep wearing another expensive suit, this one charcoal gray with a silk tie that probably cost more than Elizabeth spent on groceries in a month. "We need to talk about your moving timeline," Derek said without preamble, pushing past her into the living room as if he already owned the place. "Sarah and I have been discussing logistics, and we've identified several senior living facilities that might be appropriate for your needs. There's one about 40 minutes from here that has immediate availability." Elizabeth closed the door slowly, trying to gather her composure. "I haven't agreed to leave, Derek. This is still my home, regardless of what paperwork you think gives you the right to evict me." Derek's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Elizabeth, denial isn't going to change the legal reality of your situation. The house is in Sarah's name now, and the business assets are part of her inheritance. You're living here at our discretion, and that discretion has limits." "Show me the papers," Elizabeth said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "If you're so confident about the legal standing, show me exactly what documents give you the authority to remove me from my own home." Derek's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty, but he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "The will was read 6 weeks ago, Elizabeth. You were there. Sarah inherited the house and the business, just as Robert intended. The fact that you've chosen to ignore reality doesn't change the legal facts." Elizabeth remembered that day with painful clarity. She had sat in James Mitchell's office in a fog of grief, barely processing the words being spoken around her. Sarah had been there, holding her hand and whispering reassurances about how nothing would change, how they would always be family. Derek had been notably absent from that meeting, claiming a work emergency that couldn't be postponed. Now Elizabeth wondered if his absence had been strategic rather than accidental. "I want to see the actual documents," Elizabeth repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Not your interpretation of them, but the actual legal papers. If I'm being forced from my home, I deserve to understand exactly why." Derek's jaw tightened, and for a moment, his mask of false civility slipped entirely. "You don't trust your own daughter's word? Sarah has explained the situation multiple times. The inheritance is straightforward. The house and business go to the next generation, which means Sarah. Your role now is to step aside gracefully and allow us to secure the family's future." The way he spoke about Sarah as if she were merely an extension of his own ambitions made Elizabeth's blood boil. Her daughter had once been so independent, so full of her own dreams and aspirations. Sarah had wanted to be a teacher, had spent years studying childhood development and educational theory, but somehow those dreams had been abandoned after her marriage to Derek, replaced by his vision of what their life should be. "Where is Sarah?" Elizabeth asked. "If these are family decisions, why isn't my daughter here to discuss them with me directly?" "Sarah is at home taking care of our children," Derek replied curtly. "Someone needs to maintain stability for the family while these transitions take place. She trusts me to handle the business aspects of this situation." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Sarah's absence from these crucial conversations was becoming a pattern, and Derek's explanations were beginning to sound more like excuses. "I want to speak with her. If she's truly supportive of these plans, she can tell me herself." Derek's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with obvious irritation. "That's not necessary, Elizabeth. Sarah and I discuss everything together. We're united in our decisions regarding the family's future." The possessive way Derek spoke about her daughter triggered a protective instinct that Elizabeth hadn't felt in years. Something was deeply wrong with this entire situation, beyond even the obvious cruelty of forcing her from her home. Sarah's behavior, Derek's aggressive pushiness, the convenient absence of actual legal documentation, it all felt orchestrated in a way that made Elizabeth's instincts scream warnings. "I'm going to call James Mitchell," Elizabeth announced, moving toward the telephone. "If everything is as straightforward as you claim, he can explain the legal details to me directly." Derek stepped quickly between Elizabeth and the phone, his movement so sudden and aggressive that she instinctively stepped backward. "That's not necessary, Elizabeth. Legal consultations are expensive, and you need to be mindful of your limited resources. Besides, Mitchell is busy with other clients. These matters don't require his involvement." The desperation in Derek's voice was barely concealed now, and Elizabeth realized she had struck a nerve. If the legal situation was as clear-cut as Derek claimed, why would he be so opposed to her speaking with the family lawyer? Why would he be concerned about legal fees for a simple consultation with someone who had been handling their affairs for decades? "Get away from that phone," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying a note of steel that surprised them both. "This is still my house, and I'll call whomever I choose to call." Derek's face flushed red, and for a moment, Elizabeth saw something truly ugly in his expression. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be, Elizabeth. We're trying to be generous, trying to make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. But if you insist on being obstinate, we can make things very unpleasant for you." The threat hung in the air between them, no longer veiled in false politeness. Elizabeth felt her heart racing, but alongside the fear came something else, a growing anger that burned away some of the fog of grief that had clouded her thinking for weeks. Robert wouldn't have wanted her to cower before this bully who was masquerading as family. "Are you threatening me in my own home?" Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Derek seemed to realize he had revealed too much, and he quickly attempted to regain his composure. "Of course not, Elizabeth. I'm simply pointing out that legal battles are expensive and emotionally draining. Wouldn't it be better for everyone if we could resolve this amicably?" Elizabeth moved past him to the telephone, her determination overriding her fear. Derek watched her with obvious frustration, but didn't physically interfere as she dialed James Mitchell's office number from memory. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Mitchell Law Office. This is James speaking." "James, this is Elizabeth Thompson," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to schedule an appointment to review Robert's will and discuss some legal questions that have arisen." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Elizabeth. I'm so sorry for your loss. Robert was a good man and a dear friend. When would you like to come in?" "As soon as possible," Elizabeth replied, acutely aware of Derek's intense stare. "It's rather urgent. I have an opening this afternoon at 2 o'clock, if that works for you," James offered. "Would you like me to pull Robert's file before you arrive?" "Yes, please. I need to review all the documents related to our estate planning and the business succession," Elizabeth said, feeling more confident with each word. After ending the call, Elizabeth turned to face Derek, who was struggling to maintain his composure. "I'll have my answers this afternoon," she told him. "If everything is as you've described, then we can proceed with your plans. But if there are discrepancies, we'll need to have a very different conversation." Derek's smile was tight and forced. "Of course, Elizabeth. I'm confident that Mitchell will confirm everything Sarah and I have told you. But remember, legal consultations can be expensive, and you'll need to be careful with your finances going forward." After Derek left, Elizabeth sat in Robert's chair and allowed herself to feel a small spark of hope for the first time in days. Something about Derek's behavior suggested that the situation might not be as hopeless as it appeared. Tomorrow's meeting with James Mitchell couldn't come soon enough. Elizabeth arrived at Mitchell Law Office 15 minutes early, her hands clutching a worn leather purse that Robert had bought her for their 10th anniversary. The familiar scent of old books and polished wood greeted her as she entered the building, bringing back memories of happier times when she and Robert had visited James to discuss estate planning and business expansions. Back then, those meetings had felt routine, almost boring in their predictability. Now, this single appointment felt like it might determine the entire trajectory of her remaining years. James Mitchell emerged from his office with the same warm smile that had comforted the Thompson family through various legal matters over the past 2 decades. At 55 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built his practice on integrity and genuine care for his clients. His silver-rimmed glasses and conservative navy suit gave him an air of trustworthiness that Elizabeth desperately needed in this moment of crisis. "Elizabeth, please come in," James said, gesturing toward his office. "I've pulled all of Robert's files, and I have to say, there are some aspects of his estate planning that we should discuss in detail." The tone in James's voice carried a weight that made Elizabeth's stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. She followed him into the office, noting how he carefully closed the door behind them, something he had never done during their previous casual consultations. The mahogany desk was covered with neat stacks of documents, and Elizabeth could see Robert's familiar signature on several visible pages. "Please, sit down," James said, moving around to his chair. "Elizabeth, I want you to know that Robert was very thorough in his estate planning. Very thorough indeed. He came to see me several times over the past 2 years, and he was quite specific about his intentions regarding your financial security." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she placed them in her lap. "James, I need to understand something. Derek has been telling me that Sarah inherited the house and the business, and that I have no legal right to remain in my home. Is that accurate?" James's eyebrows rose slightly, and he reached for a thick folder labeled Thompson Estate, Confidential. "That's not entirely accurate, Elizabeth. In fact, it's quite far from the truth. Robert was very concerned about your welfare, and he took some rather sophisticated steps to protect your interests." The relief that flooded through Elizabeth was so intense that she felt dizzy. "What do you mean? What kind of steps?" James opened the folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across the desk so Elizabeth could see them clearly. "Let me start with the house. While it's true that the deed shows Sarah as the owner, there's something called a life estate attached to the property. Robert specifically included a clause that gives you the absolute right to live in that house for the remainder of your life, regardless of who holds the title." Elizabeth stared at the documents, trying to process what James was telling her. "So Derek can't force me to leave?" "Absolutely not," James said firmly. "Any attempt to remove you from that property would be a violation of the life estate provision. You have every legal right to remain there until you choose to leave or until you pass away. Sarah owns the property on paper, but you own the right to live there." The weight that had been crushing Elizabeth's chest for days began to lift slightly. "What about the business? Derek claims he's going to take over Thompson Construction." James's expression grew more serious, and he pulled out another set of documents. This is where Robert's planning becomes quite interesting, Elizabeth. The business assets are held in a trust structure that Robert established 2 years ago. While Sarah is listed as a beneficiary, the actual control of the business operations and assets rests with the trustee. Who is the trustee? Elizabeth asked, though something in James's expression suggested she might not expect the answer. You are, Elizabeth, James said quietly. Robert named you as the sole trustee of the Thompson Construction Trust. You have complete authority over all business decisions, including hiring, firing, financial management, and strategic planning. Sarah will inherit the business eventually, but only after certain conditions are met, and only if you determine she's capable of managing it responsibly. Elizabeth felt the room spinning around her. That's impossible. I don't know anything about running a construction business. Robert never mentioned any of this to me. James leaned forward, his expression compassionate but serious. Robert was very concerned about Derek's influence over Sarah. He came to me multiple times expressing his worries about Derek's character and his obvious interest in the family's financial assets. Robert wanted to ensure that you would be protected and that the business he spent his life building wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. The implications of what James was telling her began to sink in slowly. So when Derek said he was already working with the foreman and preparing to take over operations, he has absolutely no legal authority to do so, James confirmed. In fact, if he's been representing himself as having control over the business, he may be engaging in fraudulent activity. The foreman and all employees work for you now, Elizabeth. You're essentially the president and chief executive officer of Thompson Construction. Elizabeth's mind raced back through the past few weeks, remembering Derek's confident assertions about his plans for the business. Had he been lying outright, or was he simply ignorant of the actual legal arrangements? Either possibility suggested something deeply troubling about his character and his treatment of both her and Sarah. There's more, Elizabeth, James continued, pulling out another document. Robert established a significant financial cushion for you. There's a fund of $250,000 that's specifically designated for your personal expenses and home maintenance. This money is completely separate from the business assets and is yours to use as you see fit. Elizabeth felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Even in death, Robert had been taking care of her, anticipating problems she couldn't have imagined, and protecting her from threats she didn't know existed. He knew, didn't he? He knew Derek would try something like this. Robert was a very astute judge of character, James said gently. He loved Sarah dearly, but he was deeply concerned about Derek's motivations. He specifically instructed me to ensure that you understood all of your rights and resources if anything happened to him. The full magnitude of Derek's deception was becoming clear. He had counted on Elizabeth's grief and her unfamiliarity with legal matters to push through his plans. He had assumed she would accept his version of events without question, and he had been prepared to steal everything Robert had worked to build and protect. What about the mortgage Derek mentioned? Elizabeth asked. He said the payments would be too much for me to handle. James shuffled through the papers and found the relevant document. The house has been completely paid off for 3 years, Elizabeth. There is no mortgage. Robert used profits from the business to eliminate the debt early, specifically so you would never have to worry about housing costs. Elizabeth's anger began to build, replacing the fear and helplessness that had dominated her emotions for days. Derek hadn't just been trying to steal her home and her security. He had been lying to her about virtually every aspect of her financial situation. The manipulation was so calculated and cruel that it took her breath away. Why would Derek tell me there was a mortgage if there isn't one? Elizabeth asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer even as she spoke. Because he needed you to believe you were financially vulnerable, James explained. If you knew you owned your home free and clear and had substantial financial resources, you never would have considered his demands reasonable. Fifi? Elizabeth thought about Sarah's behavior during Derek's confrontations, her reluctance to meet her mother's eyes, her apparent acceptance of Derek's plans. "James, do you think Sarah knows about these arrangements? Does she understand what Derek is trying to do?" James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I can't speak to what Sarah knows or doesn't know, but I can tell you that Robert was very worried about Derek's influence over her. He mentioned that Sarah seemed to have lost much of her independence since her marriage, and he was concerned that she might not be able to stand up to Derek if he tried to manipulate the inheritance." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Derek had isolated Sarah from her family's financial affairs, just as he had isolated her from many of her friendships and interests. He had positioned himself as the expert on all matters relating to money and business, ensuring that Sarah would depend on his interpretation of events rather than seeking independent information. "What should I do now?" Elizabeth asked. "How do I handle this situation with Derek?" James's expression grew stern. "First, you need to understand that you hold all the cards in this situation, Elizabeth. Derek has no legal standing whatsoever. You own the right to live in your house, you control the business, and you have substantial financial resources. Second, if Derek has been misrepresenting his authority to business associates or employees, we may need to consider legal action to protect the company's interests." Elizabeth felt a strength returning to her voice that had been absent for weeks. "I want to call a meeting with the foreman and key employees. I need to understand exactly what Derek has been telling them and what damage might need to be repaired." "That's an excellent idea," James agreed. "I can draft a letter officially notifying all business associates that you are the legal authority for Thompson Construction, and that any previous communications from Derek Hayes should be disregarded." As Elizabeth prepared to leave James's office, she felt like a completely different person than the one who had arrived 2 hours earlier. The helpless widow who had been accepting Derek's ultimatums was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her power and was prepared to use it. Robert's final gift to her wasn't just financial security. It was the knowledge that he had trusted her to be strong enough to protect everything they had built together. The drive home felt like a victory lap, even though the real confrontation with Derek was still ahead. Elizabeth sat in her car outside the familiar offices of Thompson Construction for nearly 10 minutes, gathering the courage to walk through doors she hadn't entered since Robert's funeral. The single-story brick building looked exactly as it had for the past 15 years, with its modest sign and well-maintained landscaping, but everything felt different now that she understood her role as the company's legal owner and operator. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she watched familiar faces coming and going from the building. Men and women who had worked alongside Robert for years, building not just structures, but a reputation for excellence that extended throughout the county. Taking a deep breath that carried the scent of sawdust and concrete from the nearby work sites, Elizabeth finally stepped out of her Honda and walked toward the entrance. The receptionist, Maria Santos, looked up with surprise and immediate warmth when Elizabeth entered the lobby. Maria had been with the company for 8 years, a bilingual woman in her early 40s who handled everything from phone calls to payroll with remarkable efficiency. "Mrs. Thompson, how wonderful to see you," Maria said, rising from her desk with genuine affection. "We've all been thinking about you so much since Mr. Thompson passed. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing, Maria. Thank you for asking," Elizabeth replied, touched by the sincere concern in the younger woman's voice. "I was hoping to speak with Tom Rodriguez if he's available. Is he on site today?" Maria nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, yes. He's in the back office reviewing blueprints for the Henderson project. Should I let him know you're here?" "Please do. Tell him it's important." Within minutes, Tom Rodriguez appeared in the lobby, his weathered face breaking into a smile that couldn't quite hide the concern in his eyes. At 58 years old, Tom had been Robert's right-hand man for over 12 years, serving as foreman and project manager for the company's most important contracts. His calloused hands and sun-weathered skin told the story of decades spent in construction, and his loyalty to Robert had been absolute. "Elizabeth, it's so good to see you," Tom said, enveloping her in a brief, respectful hug. "We've all been worried about how you're doing. Robert was like a brother to me, and I know this has been incredibly difficult." "Thank you, Tom. Could we speak privately? There are some important matters I need to discuss with you about the company." Tom's expression grew more serious, and he gestured toward the back office. "Of course, let's go where we can talk without interruption." Eat. The office that had once been Robert's sanctuary still carried traces of his presence. The same wooden desk he had used for years, the wall covered with photos from completed projects, and the small coffee maker that he had insisted on using instead of the fancy machine in the break room. Elizabeth felt a pang of grief, seeing his reading glasses still sitting on the desk next to a stack of invoices, as if he might return at any moment to finish reviewing them. "Tom, I need to ask you something directly," Elizabeth began, settling into the chair across from Robert's desk. "Has Derek Hayes been in contact with you about company operations or future plans?" Tom's face immediately darkened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Yes, ma'am, he has. Started coming around about 2 weeks after the funeral, saying he was going to be taking over management of the business. To be honest, Elizabeth, it didn't sit right with me. Derek doesn't know the first thing about construction, and some of his ideas were, well, they were concerning." Elizabeth felt her suspicions being confirmed with each word Tom spoke. What kind of ideas was he proposing? "He wanted to cut costs by using cheaper materials and reducing our quality control standards," Tom said, his voice heavy with disapproval. "Said we were being too conservative in our bidding, and that we could increase profits by 30% if we streamlined operations. He also mentioned bringing in his own people to handle the business side of things, which would mean laying off Maria and probably a couple of the senior crew members." The thought of Derek dismantling everything Robert had built made Elizabeth's stomach turn. Thompson Construction's reputation was built on quality work and treating employees like family. The idea of cutting corners to increase profits went against every principle Robert had instilled in the company culture. "Did he provide any documentation showing his authority to make these changes?" Elizabeth asked. Tom shook his head firmly. "I asked him for something in writing, and he got pretty hostile about it. Said I was questioning his family's right to inherit the business, and that I should be grateful he was planning to keep me on at all. Honestly, Elizabeth, the whole conversation made me uncomfortable enough that I've been updating my resume, just in case." Elizabeth felt a surge of protective anger toward this man who had been so loyal to Robert and to the company. "Tom, I need you to know that Derek has no authority whatsoever to make changes to company operations. None at all." Tom's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Ma'am?" Elizabeth pulled out the documents James Mitchell had provided, spreading them across Robert's desk. "I am the legal owner and operator of Thompson Construction. Robert set up a trust arrangement that gives me complete control over all business decisions. Derek has been lying about his authority." The relief that washed over Tom's face was immediate and obvious. "Thank God. I was dreading having to work under that man. He doesn't understand what this company means to the people who work here, what Robert built with his own hands and his reputation for integrity. Tell me honestly, Tom, what condition is the business in right now? Are we financially stable? Are there any pressing concerns I should know about?" Tom's expression grew more confident as he moved into his area of expertise. "The business is in excellent shape, Elizabeth. We've got contracts lined up for the next 6 months, all with reliable clients who pay on time. The Henderson project alone is worth $200,000, and we're ahead of schedule. Robert was very conservative with the finances, always kept a substantial cash reserve for unexpected expenses." Elizabeth felt another wave of gratitude toward her late husband's careful planning. "What about the employees? How is morale since Robert's passing?" "Everyone's been concerned about the future," Tom admitted. "Losing Robert was a blow to all of us, not just professionally, but personally. He treated us like family, remembered our kids' birthdays, helped out when people were going through tough times. When Derek started coming around talking about changes and layoffs, it scared people. But knowing you're in charge, that changes everything. Elizabeth realized that she was facing a responsibility she had never imagined. These people depended on Thompson Construction not just for their paychecks, but for their sense of security and belonging. Robert had created more than a business. He had created a community, and now that community was looking to her for leadership. I'll be honest with you, Tom. I don't know much about the day-to-day operations of running a construction company, but I know what Robert valued, and I know what kind of standards he maintained. I'm going to need your help and the help of the other senior employees to make sure we continue operating the way Robert would have wanted. Tom nodded eagerly. You can count on me, Elizabeth, and I think I speak for everyone when I say we'd rather work for you than for Derek Hayes any day of the week. You understand what this company really stands for. There's something else I need to address, Elizabeth continued. Derek may try to contact employees directly or show up here claiming to have authority. I need everyone to understand that any communications from Derek should be ignored, and that any attempts by him to give orders or make changes should be reported to me immediately. Should I call a staff meeting to make sure everyone gets the message? Tom asked. Yes, please do. And Tom, I want you to continue managing the day-to-day operations exactly as you have been. You know Robert's standards better than anyone, and I trust your judgment completely. As Elizabeth prepared to leave the office, she felt a sense of purpose returning to her life for the first time since Robert's death. She wasn't just protecting her own financial security, she was protecting the livelihoods of people who had been loyal to her family for years. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also empowering in a way she hadn't expected. Elizabeth, Tom called as she reached the door, Robert would be proud of you. He always said you were stronger than you realized. The drive home was filled with a mixture of emotions. Elizabeth felt empowered by her new understanding of her situation, but she also felt the weight of confronting Derek with the truth. He had built his plans on lies and manipulation, and when those lies were exposed, she had no idea how he might react. The thought of facing his anger was frightening, but the thought of continuing to live under his threats was even worse. As she pulled into her driveway, Elizabeth noticed Derek's car parked across the street. He was sitting behind the wheel, apparently waiting for her return. The sight of him lurking near her property like a predator sent a chill down her spine, but it also strengthened her resolve. Tomorrow, she would have to confront him with the truth about his lies, and she would need every ounce of courage she could muster. Elizabeth's phone began ringing at 6:45 in the morning, jolting her from the first peaceful sleep she had experienced in weeks. The caller identification showed Derek's number, and she let it go to voicemail. Within minutes, it rang again. Then again. By 7:30, her phone had rung 18 times, each call more insistent than the last. She finally turned off the ringer and went about her morning routine, feeling a strange sense of calm despite the obvious desperation in Derek's repeated attempts to reach her. After her second cup of coffee, Elizabeth decided it was time to take control of the situation once and for all. She drove to Sarah's house, a modest 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes away. Derek's car wasn't in the driveway, which gave Elizabeth hope that she might be able to speak with her daughter privately for the first time in months. Sarah answered the door wearing a faded bathrobe, her hair unkempt and her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. The transformation from the confident young woman Elizabeth remembered was even more pronounced up close. Sarah looked fragile, almost breakable, like someone who had been carrying an impossible weight for far too long. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here? Derek said you were being difficult about the moving arrangements, but I thought, we need to talk, Sarah. Just the two of us," Elizabeth said gently. "May I come in?" Sarah glanced nervously over her shoulder, then stepped aside to let her mother enter. The house was immaculate but felt cold, lacking the warmth and personal touches that had always made Sarah's previous homes feel welcoming. Everything seemed to be arranged for display rather than comfort, as if the family lived in a museum rather than a home. "Derek isn't here," Sarah said, leading Elizabeth to the sterile living room. "He left early this morning for some kind of business meeting. He's been very stressed lately about the company transition and getting everything organized for your move." Elizabeth sat down across from her daughter, studying the woman who had once been her closest confidant. "Sarah, what do you know about your father's will and the arrangements he made for the family business?" Sarah's expression grew confused. "Derek explained everything to me. I inherited the house and the business, but the responsibilities are too much for me to handle alone. Derek has experience with business management, so it makes sense for him to take over operations while I focus on the children." "Have you actually read your father's will yourself?" Elizabeth asked carefully. "Derek read it to me," Sarah replied, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "He said the legal language was too complicated for me to understand without his help interpreting it." Elizabeth felt her heart breaking for her daughter. Derek had systematically isolated Sarah from information about her own inheritance, keeping her dependent on his version of events. "Sarah, I went to see James Mitchell yesterday. I learned some things about your father's estate planning that I think you should know." Over the next 30 minutes, Elizabeth carefully explained everything she had discovered. She watched her daughter's face change from confusion to disbelief to growing anger as the reality of Derek's deception became clear. Sarah's hands began to tremble as she realized how completely she had been manipulated. "He lied to me about everything," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "The house, the business, even your financial situation. He made me believe that you were helpless and that we had to take care of you by making these difficult decisions." "Where are the actual legal documents, Sarah? Have you ever seen them yourself?" Sarah shook her head miserably. "Derek keeps all the important papers in his office at home. He says it's safer to have everything in one place, and that I don't need to worry about those details." Elizabeth's phone, which she had turned back on during the drive to Sarah's house, suddenly erupted with incoming calls. Derek's number flashed on the screen repeatedly, and when she didn't answer, text messages began flooding in. The messages grew increasingly frantic and demanding, revealing a desperation that confirmed Elizabeth's suspicions about his true situation. "He's been calling you all morning, hasn't he?" Sarah observed, watching the phone buzz with incoming messages. 102 times since yesterday evening," Elizabeth confirmed. "I think he's beginning to realize that his plans aren't going to work out the way he expected." Sarah's expression hardened with a determination that Elizabeth hadn't seen in years. "I want to see those documents, all of them, and I want Derek to explain to me face to face why he lied about everything." They didn't have to wait long. Derek's car pulled into the driveway with obvious haste, and through the window, Elizabeth could see him talking animatedly on his phone. When he entered the house and saw Elizabeth sitting in his living room, his face went white with what appeared to be genuine fear. "Elizabeth, we need to discuss your refusal to cooperate with the family's plans," Derek began, but his usual confidence was clearly shaken. "Your unreasonable behavior is causing unnecessary complications for everyone involved." "Derek, sit down," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise her husband. "I want you to explain to me, in detail, what my father's will actually says about the inheritance." Derek's gaze darted between Sarah and Elizabeth, and his composure began to crumble visibly. "Sarah, we've discussed this multiple times. The inheritance is straightforward, and we don't need to revisit every detail." "Show me the documents," Sarah demanded, standing up with a strength Elizabeth hadn't seen from her in years. "Right now. I want to read my father's will myself." The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's face cycled through multiple expressions: anger, fear, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate resignation. When he spoke again, his voice lacked all of its previous authority. "The situation is more complicated than I initially explained," Derek admitted, his hands shaking slightly. "There are some trust arrangements and legal technicalities that affect the timing of the inheritance transfer." "What kind of technicalities?" Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer. Derek's confession came out in a rush of words, as if he couldn't contain the lies any longer. The truth was even worse than Elizabeth had imagined. Derek had been running up debts using Sarah's name and social security number, taking out loans against the anticipated inheritance. He owed nearly $120,000 to various creditors, and he had been counting on gaining control of Thompson Construction to pay off these debts before Sarah discovered them. "You've been stealing from our family," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm. "You've been lying to me about my own inheritance while running up debts in my name." "Sarah, I can explain everything," Derek pleaded. "The investments I made were supposed to benefit our family's future. I was trying to multiply the inheritance to create more security for our children." Elizabeth watched her daughter transform before her eyes. The submissive, uncertain woman was disappearing, replaced by someone who looked remarkably like the strong-willed child Elizabeth remembered. Sarah walked to Derek's home office and returned with a stack of financial documents, spreading them across the coffee table with methodical precision. "Pack your belongings and leave this house," Sarah told Derek, her voice steady and final. "I want you gone by tonight." "Sarah, you can't be serious," Derek protested. "We have children together. We have a life together. You can't throw away our marriage over a misunderstanding about business arrangements." "This isn't a misunderstanding, Derek. This is fraud. This is theft. This is years of lies and manipulation." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each accusation. "You've stolen my inheritance, lied to my mother, and tried to destroy everything my father built. That's not a marriage. That's a crime." Derek's final attempt at manipulation was pathetic and desperate. He tried tears, then anger, then threats about custody and legal battles. But Sarah had finally seen through his facade, and nothing he said could restore the power he had held over her through years of systematic emotional abuse. After Derek left with a single suitcase and a stream of empty threats, Sarah collapsed into her mother's arms and sobbed with the release of years of suppressed emotions. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I let him control me like that. I should have seen what he was doing. I should have protected you." "You were protecting yourself and your children the only way you knew how," Elizabeth said, holding her daughter close. "But you found your strength when it mattered most, and that's what your father would have wanted." Over the following weeks, Elizabeth and Sarah worked together to rebuild their relationship and secure their family's future. Thompson Construction thrived under Elizabeth's careful oversight, with Tom Rodriguez managing daily operations, while Elizabeth handled the strategic decisions that Robert had prepared her for through years of quiet observation. The company's reputation for quality and integrity attracted new clients, and within 6 months, the business was more profitable than it had ever been. Derek's debts were resolved through legal proceedings that required him to pay restitution over 5 years. His attempts to gain custody of the children failed when the court discovered his financial fraud and pattern of deception. Sarah filed for divorce and began rebuilding her life with the independence she had lost years earlier. Elizabeth eventually moved into the small country house that Robert had secretly purchased as a surprise for their retirement. The property came with 5 acres of gardens and a workshop where she could pursue the woodworking hobby Robert had always encouraged her to try. But she kept the family home as well, using it for gatherings with Sarah and the grandchildren who had been kept away from her during Derek's reign of control. On a warm Sunday afternoon, 6 months later, Elizabeth and Sarah sat together in the garden where Robert had collapsed, watching the grandchildren play among the roses that continued to bloom with remarkable resilience. Sarah had returned to school to finish her teaching degree, and Elizabeth had discovered that running a business was not nearly as intimidating as she had feared. "Dad knew, didn't he?" Sarah asked, watching her 8-year-old son carefully tend to a small section of the garden that Elizabeth had designated as his special project. He knew Derek would try something like this, and he made sure you would be strong enough to protect all of us. Elizabeth smiled, touching the pearl necklace that had become her talisman of strength. Your father always said that love isn't just about being together during the good times. Real love is about protecting the people you care about, even when you can't be there to do it in person. As the sun set over the garden that Robert had lovingly created, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of peace that had nothing to do with money or property or business success. She had discovered that strength had been inside her all along, waiting for the moment when her family needed her most. Derek's greed had been intended to destroy everything Robert had built, but instead, it had revealed the unbreakable foundation of love and determination that Robert had spent 37 years carefully constructing. The grandfather clock in the house chimed 8 times, marking another moment in a life that had been transformed by loss into something richer and more meaningful than Elizabeth had ever imagined possible. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below. What city are you watching from? And if your heart tells you to, feel free to leave me a tip on Buy Me a Coffee. Just check the first pinned comment. Thanks for keeping me company and for the coffee, and I'll see you in the next story.